All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this panel discussion of Canadian comics today. We're joined by five people who have, hopefully, you have all watched their presentations. All of them interesting, like real breadth of material, types of looking at comics and material here. We are going to ask each of the participants to introduce themselves and talk very briefly about what it is, just in case you don't remember the specifics of the talk, which you all watched, right? Irene, would you care to go first?
I would love to. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody just because it's a very graphic presentation. Can everybody see this okay? Great. So my name is Irene Valencias. I play a number of roles. I'm a PhD doing a dissertation on mental illness comics. I work with TCAF as their programming and partnerships officer. I'm an editor with Highwater Press, Portage in Maine. I write for the Comics Journal. I've co-edited a volume with my supervisor, Nancy Pedri, on mental illness and sexuality in comics. So I am an advisor to the CCAL library, so I'm very excited to be a part of that organization as well. So that's how I came to be here today, through Canada's and Rose's invitation. And so my presentation looked at On Diversity, BookNet's survey that they did of Canadian readers. And I found two interesting results of that survey. One, which was that readers wanted to read more books about mental health challenges, and the other that readers wanted to read more graphic novels and comics. And I thought it was a good time to see what was out there in the landscape of independent comics regarding mental illness. And so I did my own survey because I was grappling with issues of homogeneity in my own dissertation corpus that I wanted to address. So while my survey isn't exhausted, the sample does include 67 independent comics by a total of 63 creators. And all authorial demographics listed were self-identified or marked as unlisted. So what we see is that there's been a proliferation of mental illness comics over the past 10 years, starting with Justin Green's Binky Brown in 1972, then a few over the 1990s, and then a steady increase in the 2000s and a real proliferation in the past decade. So 90.4% of these comics come from these four big countries, which are the US, Canada, UK, and France. Only 6.3% of the creators in the survey were considered to be visible minorities. We also see that there's a sizable gender imbalance in the creators of mental illness comics, with the majority identifying as female. And this may reflect gender biases in mental illness to begin with. So within the previous gender-based self-categorizations, there's a disproportionately higher percentage of female identifying LGBT plus creators in the sampling than male identifying or non-binary identifying LGBT plus creators. So when it comes to which mental illness is used as the subject, we see the highest categorization in depression and anxiety narratives, which are proportionally the largest populations of mental illness that affect the public. And we have seen in the past 2 years new proliferations of different types of mental illness narratives, like borderline personality disorder, of which have only been published in the past couple of years. The majority of the texts feature the narrator protagonist as the person experiencing the mental illness. And otherwise, if it's somebody else observing the character with mental illness, we find that it's typically someone who's observing a female character, like a mother figure. So a majority of these narratives are classified as nonfiction narratives, with 10% being about fictional accounts. And the balance of those are an in-between of semi-biographical, fictional, but based on the author's real experiences, and so on. And then I took a look at which ones were from established presses and which ones were self-published, and about 20% comes from a self-published demographic. And so what I kind of gathered from all these different numbers in the survey was that the sample that I observed is overwhelmingly white, cisgendered, and middle class in its perspective. One potential reason may be because of different cross-cultural understandings of mental illness and the related stigmas. One of the only books that I saw to mention cross-cultural references of mental illness was Ellen Forney's Rocksteady. We see that mental illness comics are gender imbalanced with the favor of female identifying authors and narrators. And we see many different types of illnesses represented. We also see self-publication as a democratizing avenue, but also that comes with the downside of sometimes those publications are more difficult to find. They're not taken up by educational institutions or libraries, so their reach can be limited. And we also can see that these comments can also break what Julie Smart calls the false categorization of the stereotype that all people with the same kind of disability are classified as having the same experiences. So with the proliferation of these narratives, we can see many different experiences coming into play for what is categorically a similar mental illness. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm working with the list in the order in which I received it. Rotem, would you care to follow?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to do what Irene did and attempt to screen share to sort of keep me on track here. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm able to do that here. That's okay. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about my presentation, and I guess I'll start off by introducing myself. So I'm Rotem. I also go by Ro, and I use they, them pronouns. I am a librarian, and I founded and I help run the Canada Comics Open Library, or CCOL. I am currently working in an academic library, and I'm a zine maker, and I draw comics as well, mostly for myself, but I do self-publish them and sell them online and at zine fairs as well. And they sort of, for the most part, deal with semi-autobiographical narratives, themes of cuteness and identity, and coming to terms with life experiences. And so for my talk, I mostly shared my experience of creating the Canadian Cartoonist Database, which is a project hosted on CCOL's website to help showcase Canadian creators, including marginalized creators and self-published works and lesser known comics, as well as historical comics like the Canadian Whites, and through the database to help sort of towards those goals of increasing representation, it is searchable by keyword. So you can search the database by like identity keywords, biographical keywords, like the creator, if the creator is BIPOC, or if they're Indigenous, the city that they're from, and you can also search by genre and roles. So you can search if they do maybe fantasy comics or autobiographical comics, or and also for roles, you can search if they're the creator, like the inker, the penciler, and the editor and stuff like that. So yeah, you can search by keywords separated by comma values. And so I talked about my experience of creating that, and also looking for creators and small press to add to the database. And so I shared some of the resources that I used for that. I guess I'll share some of those with you now. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at at presenting on the spot. I guess I'm nervous, but anyway. So I used the Cartoonist database, the Cartoonist of Color database, and the I'm starting to use the Disabled cartoonist database that were created by Mari Naomi, who's also a cartoonist. And I also used Canadian zine and comics fairs vendor lists, and visiting those spaces in person was really great as well. I also used the Canadian Comics Archive, which is a really great pre-internet alternative comics archive. And they're all digitized, which is pretty amazing. And that was created by Robin McConnell of Ink Studs. And he's also the executive director of VanCap now. And I also, in my research, put together for myself initially a list of Canadian comics publishers, and all of that is available on CCAL's blog, because just in case anyone else would find that helpful. I also initially was using the Joe Shuster Awards, just looking at also Canadian awards, past winners and nominees was a really great help for creating the database. And they used to have aggregated list resources on their website. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but for a time I was using those, and that was really helpful. They might be revamping their website. And then also online archives like the Guardians of the North, the National Superhero and Canadian Comic Book Art, which I use the website of an archival exhibition curated by Canadian comic scholar and archivist John Bell. And yeah, so I went over, so I spoke about some of the resources in the database. And I also wanted to frame the discussion sort of to acknowledge colonialism in Canada, and that not all of the creators in the database necessarily identify with being Canadian, either by choice or because they might be like not able to obtain like Canadian citizenship. They might be a migrant worker, and for those reasons they can be left out of other spaces that other people have access to. And also yeah, so and I mentioned in my talk that a few years ago I attended a TCAF event called Critical History of Canadian Alternative Comics. And in this talk, critic, curator, and editor Kim Ju has sort of highlighted creators that were traditionally left out of Canadian comics history, and spoke about the like potential inequities of Canadian spaces, awards, and honors that do have strict nationalistic definition of who can qualify to be a Canadian creator, including people who might have been born here and moved elsewhere, or just worked in Canada for a few years, but had to move elsewhere, maybe for life reasons. So, and then they're left out of those spaces. And then what funding opportunities and structures are individuals or groups left out of if they don't fit within those certain requirements of nationalistic identity. And also, I wanted to think about how working within Canadian comics, how do we navigate sort of working within the parameters of certain words like Canada or Canadian that hold so much power to alienate, harm, and exclude many people who can't choose them or do not choose them to define their identity or work. And yeah, and so through my work with CCAL and CCAL's initiatives, I do want to acknowledge that Canada itself is a natural reality that, while is a symbol of hope and a safe place to many people, has also harmed, murdered, and devastated generations of human lives. So throughout my presentation, I shared collectives that were in the database as well, because community building is I think really a really important way to sort of combat systemic inequities in Canadian spaces. And I don't want to ramble too much right now, but I also shared a list of really great distros. The last panel was talking about how the difficulty of distribution with small press and self-published work. So part of what I wanted to do with CCAL is to help increase accessibility to those narratives through the database, through zines and self-published work in the CCAL catalog, which is all accessible online, and including those lesser known creators in the database as well. And there are many online zine distros, not zine comic specific distros in Canada, but many zine distros that do carry those more independent works. And so I curated a list of those spaces on the CCAL website as well. And I mentioned other comics spaces that do work towards increasing accessibility of lesser known creators and marginalized creators throughout the presentation as well, and the resources that are available on CCAL's website. And I think I will leave it there. I'm sorry about my rambling.
All right, Matthew.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. So my name is Matt Barrett, and I got a PhD in history from Queen's in 2019, and I'm just completing a postdoc at the Canadian War Museum. And so what I'm interested in is this idea of graphic history. So combining the type of academic history that might appear in peer-reviewed journals and scholarly books, university press books, with original illustrations, with comics, with pictures. So just I'm interested in finding, is there a space for academics to publish that type of non-traditional academic work in those type of sources? Because it tends to be that journals and books are focused on text. That's the way that the history profession kind of operates. So as I've always been interested in drawing and in art. And you know, like I made comics as a kid, and that was always a part of my interest in history. But eventually, through graduate school, you have to focus on the skills that are important in that setting, and so that's about critical analysis and writing and reading, and so very much text-based. So when I was coming to the end of my PhD and thinking ahead of, you know, is there a possibility of a postdoc afterwards? I thought, well, if I do a postdoc, I'd like to do something different than just kind of the traditional history I've been doing up to this point. And so I was interested, well, is there an opportunity to do something like graphic history? And, you know, graphic history is starting to kind of appear more and more. It's getting more and more attention. But it tends to be still outside of kind of the academic sphere of doing history. So you might see articles or books talk about other creators who are making historically based comic books, but that analysis tends to be written, tends to be text. And so I'm interested in creating kind of a historically based comic approach to the study of the past. So in my presentation, I talked about some of the opportunities that I think that this approach can have to contribute to history. So the accessibility of trying to reach an audience beyond the traditional specialist academic community. For education as a resource for learning about the study of the past. And then I think the third, and maybe the most important, is about kind of creating and encouraging historians to reflect on their role in how they represent and visualize and understand the past. And so in my presentation, I just used as an example a recent combination academic article comic book that I published with the journal Canadian Military History, which I guess is maybe one of the first kind of comic book approaches that have been published as a peer-reviewed article in a history journal. And I just I worked through some of the artistic concepts, some of the contributions that I think that this graphic history approach can make to the study and understanding of Canada's past.
Thank you. Lucas.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luke Tromly. I teach at the University of Manitoba. I actually don't have anything to do with Canadian studies in general, so it's a real treat for me to be here today. So I'm really at the beginning of my research into Filipino, and Filipinx comics. And I should say, if anybody has recommendations for things you know about, I would absolutely love to hear them. It seems as though as much as comic studies is embracing diversity, some communities are still being left behind a little bit. And I think exposure is important, and that's part of what I hope that I'm doing. I think this is especially true for Filipino North American communities, whose experience is often characterized through the trope of invisibility. And I think this condition of invisibility may be particularly acute for Filipino Canadians. I am organizing a symposium for Filipino Canadian comics creators through the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities in March 2022. And I hope everyone can join us because it should be fun. So I don't want to talk about the body of Filipino Canadian or Filipino North American comics reductively. It's very diverse, but in general, I'll say this body of work does seem to raise a lot of interesting questions about nation. In the talk I posted, I discussed two Filipino Canadian narratives that don't seem particularly interested in talking about Canada, or maybe in a more nuanced way, we could say that insist that any discussion of Canada take place in sort of a larger transnational framework. From the perspective of Filipino American literary studies, I think scholars are accustomed to seeing narratives that instead of giving us teleological narratives about immigration to the States, we see a lot of narratives of kind of homecoming and return, right? Whether either literal or sort of imagined. And I think that this is a thread in this body of comics that I'm interested in pursuing. For example, a lot of Filipino North American comics creators incorporate kind of superstitions and kind of folklore into their work, and this makes perfect sense to me because this stuff is camera ready, or panel ready, right? Visually, it's so interesting. And it seems to me very much in keeping with sort of trends in sort of fantasy comics. I wonder if the use of this material, in a sense, is itself a kind of a form of return, and if we can kind of understand it that way. I think all in all, I'm interested in how Filipino Canadian comics and Filipino North American comics introduce issues of transnationalism and an awareness of imperial history into our conversation, and how it might sort of trouble or nuance received narratives of Canadian multiculturalism. And I should say, just to close, clearly a lot of these questions behind my work is not tied to the Filipino diaspora specifically, and I think that this is a conversation that needs to engage with lots of different diasporic and immigrant histories. Thanks.
Thank you. Zviane, you want to wrap this up for us?
My mic was off. Hello, my name is Zviane. I'm a comic book writer from Quebec, Montreal, French Canadian. I'm a bit nervous because I'm an artist. I'm not a scholar. I'm not used to speak in front of people. Usually I'm just in front of my sheet of paper and talking to no one. So this is the life of a comic book writer. If you don't know, we just work all the time. And yeah, I've been working on a big project. I was talking in my video about this project called La Jungle, which is a very strange project because it's self-published. Well, it's all self-published except one book out of 8. And I think one of the most special thing about it is that it doesn't have any copyright, and my name is not on the cover. Like, it's a kind of project with no ego. Like, sometimes when I make comics, I have the feeling that I'm not really the author of what I'm doing. Like, I'm just receiving stuff. Like, I'm taking a shower and then there's an idea that pops in my mind and I just write it down and I make a comic out of it. And it's not necessarily like, I don't feel I have the right to say it's mine. I have the property, and you don't have you cannot copy my stuff and anything. So it's I just throw it to the world, and sometimes I have collaborators also in my books, and they don't have their name on those also. So it's very mixed up culture also. So yeah, it's a strange project. And what else can I say about? Oh, and the thing about the self-publishing comic here, I would be very interested in knowing how it works in the English comic world, because I'm not sure there's enough bridge between the world of French comics and English-speaking comics in Canada, but I'm very interested to help building them if it's possible. But I really wonder if there's something to do with like, sometimes we think about self-publishing as if it was a way to learn to do comics or learn to do books in order to get published. Like, it's a thing for beginner and then you get better. But I think that right now the market is changing. And here it's special in Quebec because the market is super small. And yes, you can throw your book in France, but it's another world. And because they go on the other side of the ocean, it costs a lot. So the price of the book becomes super high compared to the other books. So the market is pretty much here in Quebec. So since the market is so different, you don't have to, like, the concept of a bestseller is quite different here. Like, here, when you sell 2,000 books, you're wow, I sell 2,000 books. That's amazing. So in this idea, self-publishing is not so different from publishing with a real publisher, because the print runs are pretty small. So you can be a published author and still want to continue your work as self-publishing to have more freedom. So this is what is maybe special about, like, the French comic scene, that would be a little bit different. So, but again, I have to say, I don't know a lot and I'm here to learn. So if you can teach me how it works in the other side of the language of Canada, I would be very grateful. And I think that's it.
All right. Well, everyone has introduced themselves, and I think we have, maybe we'll all agree that to find a single question that would be perfect for everyone to answer in turn would be a little difficult. I came up with at least one. When I described these to my colleagues here, we decided to maybe it would be good if I put to you a question that we wrestle with quite often when we're selling comics and graphic novels to particularly to younger folks. And this ties into a lot of things people have talked about in terms of diversity and representation. And this is an idea, not ours, that books can often be either a mirror showing, like, reflecting who you are, or a window through which you see somebody else's experience. And in the case of, I should just make sure I'm being heard here. Am I being heard here? Oh, yep. Okay.
You are being heard, yes.
I got a nod. Now, we all would agree and tell perhaps teachers or librarians who are buying from us that it is a terrible, terrible thing if a young person wants to read comics and doesn't see themselves represented in any way in the books that they see before them. But in turn, once we have read so many comics and you know, obviously as a cis white male have seen myself represented just plenty. There is a desire to use comics as a way to read and experience in the sense of a window to see another person's experiences, and a tool for developing empathy. Now, this is an analogy has worked for us very well, but we're starting to get a little tired of it. And I'm just want to throw this out to everyone here. If there's anything from their own experience with either as comics readers, but more specifically with the comics they are studying or producing, with that as a way of looking at diverse voices or diverse or representations of diverse characters. Does anyone want to jump on that as an idea?
I don't mind starting us off. And
right.
Peter, I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench into your metaphor and say it's a kaleidoscope. It is both a mirror and a window.
Sure.
Just to say that sometimes we don't even know it's a mirror until we get far enough into it. But I think the more representation we have, the more voices we have, the more points of view we have, the more artistic visions that we have, the more we create a palette of what our society is really like, the more that we create the ideas of our society, or recreate or engage with or grapple with these ideas. And I think that a good book or a good story should function both ways, should help us achieve new insights, but should also help us achieve a reflection of ourselves and who we want to be or become. And if that representation isn't there, we cannot ourselves become diverse. We cannot ourselves become liberal and democratic thinkers. So that's where I'd like to kind of take that direction. And something that I just tack onto that, something that I saw in all of my fellow panelists kind of work was this idea of ambiguity, and that comics actually encompasses that ambiguity and that tension, what is unknown, unseen, unsubstantiated, intangible, those things, and often holds up that intangibility and ambiguity for our examination. Now I pass it on to you all.
Anyone?
I can maybe jump in here with something. I think, yeah, I can see where you are coming from and agree with everything Irene just said. But I think there's also this tension between, like, especially for marginalized creators, being forced to tell certain stories over and over again. But then there's the freedom in kind of self-publishing and making zines to tell whatever the hell you want, to sort of experiment more within that. But it can be disheartening and to see, you know, big name publishers publishing the same type of like diverse narratives over and over, and pigeonholing certain creators to tell those narratives. But yeah, I think there is more freedom within like experimental comics and small press and self-publishing to to share your stories, but in a way that's really unique to yourself. And yeah, I'll
If I can just jump on Rotem's kind of great point. You know, when you're working with Asian North American literatures, obviously narratives of immigration are quite prominent. And of course, I don't want to discount their importance. And clearly there have been lots of really important comics versions, right? I'm thinking about Jean Lung Yang's American-Born Chinese. But to return to Peter's question, sometimes I wonder a little bit if narratives about immigration are mirrors that trick us into thinking that they're windows. You know what I mean? In the sense that often in these tellings, there's a lot of attention paid to, say, a country of destination, right? Often this is very unflattering or difficult to see, but it's there. And I think that it is interesting to think about narratives of kind of diasporic experience that really don't bother talking about sort of the country of emigration. How do I say this more clearly? That don't bother showing white readers themselves, right? That's just kind of not really much of a priority. And I anyway, I'll leave it at that. But I do think that Peter's question really raises some interesting aspects of immigration narratives.
Yeah, if I can jump in. So to look at that question maybe from my kind of historical work or from the historical perspective, that's the contribution I see that comics they're subjective, that means something that's uncreated, it's being drawn by someone, it's being constructed. That kind of reveals the fact that the historian is kind of a subjective part of the telling of the story in a way that I think that sometimes more traditional text-based history can find a way to avoid. Because if it's just the text on a printed page, there seems to be authority there, there seems to be objectivity. But then when you start to have to yourself try to visually represent something, especially visually represent the past from someone else's perspective, then you really need to kind of think about the process that you as the historian are trying to construct that, and the fact that you're part of that. You can't avoid being kind of an actor in that construction.
Yeah, and did you have anything you might want to add to this discussion as someone who actually does the work?
Are you talking to me? No.
I was just going to say, as someone who's actually producing the comics, producing comics, as I guess the rest of us all as readers and analyzers, the idea of diversity in the work that is being produced, and whether this is something that that we're concerned about as reflecting the experience of the reader, or as showing the reader something they haven't seen before.
Yeah, of course, but I could not talk about something I'm not living. Like, I could not speak about the immigration as I'm not an immigrant. My boyfriend comes from Colombia, and we had quite some experiences about immigration here in Canada. But overall, it was like I don't feel I could speak about something I'm not living directly. And I'm always super interested in reading those stories, but I see more and more of them. Sometimes I see it as a plant growing, because sometimes I think that in the past there are some very important voices that are very uniform, and some marginal voices that didn't really feel that they had something to say, even if they had, just because it was not in the normal path, if you want. But at the same time, I really feel that the things are changing right now, and the plant is growing, and we don't have to pull the plant. Like, it's nature doing its thing, and we're I feel super lucky to be in Canada right now, because I'm really interested in like this cultural all melting pots of stuff happening, and I see it more and more since a few years, especially because my boyfriend is at McGill in Montreal, and this is some university with a lot of international students. But it's not in comic at all, but I see something emerging out of all this melting pots of cultures, of course.
I'm going to now, I will point out that in the chat, people have been adding links and suggestions of books that line up with some of the various topics we are talking about here. So if anyone has a particular interest in knowing more has already been contributed for you to scroll back through before the end of the talk. I'm going to try and articulate another question around the specifics of comics as to what we've been talking about. I'm trying to remember who's many of the things that we initially were saying could have been applied to discussions of fiction or film, but there is something about comics being able to deal with certain aspects just by a background detail, or in thinking about the immigrant experience and not having to talk about Canada that specifically, but the details could be there to be read, not in the foregrounded narrative. Does anyone have any feelings about comics as having an edge specifically for this type of storytelling?
So I've actually got a question for Matthew.
Okay.
I saw in your posted talk, there was an image of Michael Vann's The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, which is a really, really interesting work of graphic history. One of the things, and sort of thinking about Peter's question, one of the things that strikes me about that text is from time to time, you'll see panels of basically kind of Vann lecturing on the material that's simultaneously being presented through images, right? It seems these sort of weird little moments of kind of self-reflection. And it seems as though this is something that a graphic history could do in a way that maybe a written history couldn't do, right? And I'm just wondering if that element of kind of self-reflection is something that you see in kind of in general in the work of graphic history, and just I guess sort of also for Irene. I mean, I guess whether what kind of self-reflexivity you see in the text that you're researching.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think self-reflection is a huge part of graphic history and of comic creation in general. And it shows that there's really two forms of communication going on, the image and the text. And sometimes those can be reinforcing. So the text can clarify the images, add context, or sometimes they can be in contradiction. And that way you can maybe have two different narratives of the same event going on. And on the issue of kind of self-reflection, that you can draw maybe yourself as the narrator of this story. Or sometimes what I do in my work is I go that the picture is unfinished, or the picture is in process. So I draw kind of the maybe a sketch that turns into the fully colored image, just to emphasize that what's being presented here is my interpretation. It's based on my research, but it's still based on my perception and interpretation of a particular incident. And so I think that's another huge contribution that comics can make. The idea of the different forms of communication that are going on and the multiple perspectives that you can show and tell.
I might add to that comics is one of the mediums where a change in style of line work is possible in a way that is much more noticeable than it would be in prose, and less cliched than it might be in film. That I think your work takes advantage of changes in rendering styles panel to panel for that effect.
I just wanted to add, I think with graphic history as well, like I trust sort of retellings of historical events in graphic novel form, because often you can sort of see the creator more. You can see their hand and the physicality of the narrative, and it's not just this like objective voice or authoritative voice, but you can you can like see it as someone who has reflected on and researched, and like you can see their perspective and their hand in the work. And also for graphic history, I think it's just in terms of understanding the past. When you read prose or you read writing, you might not be able to visualize something, but you can just see it in a comic without having to create this picture in your imagination for something that maybe you've never encountered before. So it can take space away from, I mean, it can create more space for other dynamics in the narrative, because you don't have to exert so much effort in trying to visualize something that you have never seen or heard of before. And then you can explore other dynamics about a historical event or social dynamics. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to tie some of those concepts together between Peter and Lucas. I think self-reflexivity is one of the things that comics does both in the foreground and in the background. And bear with me as I give you a couple of examples. Margaret Kimball's "And Now I Spill the Family Secrets" is a text entirely comprised of documentation and no visual characters unless they are seen in photographs. And even then, the faces are blanked out. So it is a piecing together of documentation in order to tell this story in comics form. Hannah Bradshaw's Dark Early is a completely wordless narrative, which doesn't even have paratext around it outside of the title. And the story being about depression, even when they are in places like school and home, the places are empty. And whether they're really empty or not is not the case. It speaks to the isolation of depression through an extended visual metaphor. While Miranda Tristan's Asleep, a new graphic text self-published on borderline personality disorder, takes a clipboard with the medical sheet of the diagnostic criteria of borderline personality disorder and crosses it out, adds arrows, adds examples, puts thought bubbles into the official narrative of what borderline personality disorder is supposed to be, and overwrites it with her subjective experience as she's coming to terms with this definitional categorization that may or may not really describe her own experiences. So these are ways that comics synthesize words and images to give us concepts beyond what words and images alone can do. So I think that that intellectual gutter space, not the physical gutter space of the page, is always enacting that self-reflexivity in the text and always enacting that greater sense of ideation happening in the text, both working for and against whatever subject matter it is. And just to wrap this up, to then potentially pass it back to my panelists, my fellow panelists, is this idea of slow journalism, which several incredible cartoonists do, such as Joe Sacco, who take these long form looks at historical issues, both through several lenses, but also through the ability to not look at it immediately like the media does in film and television and the news and photographs. They have to take a slow approach, which potentially changes the narrative entirely because of that fermentation period.
There is also something about comics that I find very interesting, is that there is the possibility of doing a comic without text, like only speak through images. And I think, to me, this is the way of binding the cultures together, because it's like music, you don't have to, the principal barrier between the cultures, usually it's the text, like when you have prose. But I'm thinking of an example. There's a comic book, Aya de Yopougon, that was published in France, which speaks, I don't remember which is the country, but it's an African country. And you can see in the text a lot of jargon and a lot of expression that you don't really understand when you speak like common French, but you understand through the image. So there is a very strong message that passed through the image that sometimes the text is a little bit secondary. So by this mean, I think that the comic can be a very, very powerful tool to express a culture, because you just get out of the text.
Since you are talking right now, Zviane, we had a question in the comments here that was directed towards you.
Yeah.
A couple of them. One is, do you include images of yourself working in your comics? And two, if you have any theories, or if you can talk as to why there may not be the bridges you might expect between English language and French language Canadian comics.
For the first question, I do draw my face in my comic books when I speak about myself, but I did a lot of autobiographical stuff, but right now I'm not working on autobiographical stuff, so I don't draw myself anymore. I don't know if it answers the question. And for the other question, I have to say that maybe it was not a good idea to say that the bridges are difficult because between French and English, because maybe it's just me. Like I have a lot of friends who publish in English, who speak English and read a lot of comics. Like it's a question of pop culture. Sometimes personally I was way more interested in French published, Europe published comics when I was younger. I started to discover what was done in the English culture like way later. So it might be just me, but I think that the main problem is that most people I know that write comics know how to read in English, but the English people don't necessarily know how to read in French. And also there's the problem of the distribution. Like you don't find a lot of comics in French in the rest of Canada. Like you can order on the internet, like things are changing, but I don't think this is something that has to be pushed. I think this is something that is natural, and really I don't think we really suffer from this. But it's true that every time that I see that there's a very great comic here that is published in English, I'm super happy. But on the opposite, most of the time when there's a very good comic in English, I won't get a French copy. I will just read it in English. So this is the difference, because the like English has become the language of the planet, right? It's like when you want to travel, you have to speak in English. I went to Japan one time, and I was very sad that I could not. I had a few published comic in French. I could not share them because people there, they have difficulty with English. So imagine with French. So usually when I have my comics that are translated in English, I have 2 of them. It's way easier to travel all around the world. I don't know if it answers the question, right?
That's all important information. If I can respond to one of the things you said earlier about self-publishing and self-publishing, because that is often one, a single person enterprise doing that, is very difficult to translate that to another market, because you don't have any contacts or experiences in the other country in another language. So works that are self-published don't often get the trans-border treatment that works that a publisher is trying to agent who maybe has those contacts do. Yeah,
well, I think that even that, like when I do self-published book, I know that most of the books will stay in Montreal. Like it doesn't even go outside of Montreal, just because of the print runs. Sorry, like I don't know. This is something I would like to do in the next year, because I've been very serious about self-publishing in the past years, and I really wonder how it goes in the rest of Canada. Like it seems to be a very different market from what I know, but at the same time, it's just what I hear. Like I never had the real conversation with another author about this subject. Like I read a lot of self-published comics from Canadian English written, but I never, like when I see the author, I just drink alcohol and dance. Like we don't talk about this stuff. So this is something I would like to do more.
Can I ask a question here, Peter? Would you mind?
No, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Go for it.
Okay. This is something I feel has been kind of percolating, but not maybe necessarily just spoken in the symposium, which is the intersection of capitalistic forces and comics. Zviane, I'm very interested with your, no property, no copyright, no name kind of approach, whereas comics are, of course, very property oriented, and this is especially important for authors who are from marginalized identities, having their name on something or recognized. We talked about awards earlier and cultural capital and how that feeds into the recognition of these books and the creation of these books, as well as being a part of TCAF. Like, it is a festival, a literary festival that's a complete celebration, but it's also there to move books, to get books into people's hands. So I just feel like this is a side issue to this whole symposium, and that difference between indie versus big publishers versus self-publishing, and how financial forces are affecting both the industry and creators.
I just wanted to jump in here if I could, because this is something that, yeah, I think it's a really important part of the conversation. And I think especially in this age where we have this hyper reliance on social media and online platforms to help us access each other's work and share our work, there's like this insidious side to it where creators, including marginalized creators and those who self-publish, have so much pressure to constantly create content and engage an audience. And also the algorithms of Instagram and other platforms work against creators getting fair representation, because if you don't post, your work will be less visible. And then there's all this other pressure to, once you have an audience, you have to, with a certain type of content, to maintain your subject theme that you're sharing, or maintain a certain brand image, or if you're producing, a lot of people connect to your work about mental illness, to the pressure to keep producing work that is focused on mental illness, and what that takes from a creator, how much they have to give as opposed to what they're getting back. And yeah, the toll that takes. And also for marginalized creators not having the same amount of time that other, maybe more privileged people would have to produce content, and having to navigate working full time in a low paying job with the desire to create and be seen. And I think those are really tough things to talk about.
Even establishing the CCAL, you kind of worked against some of those forces, because CCAL is not yet a lending library, but also it's endeavoring to make comics accessible and zines accessible in a type of permanent collection.
Yeah, CCAL has a lot of challenges, but there's so much we want to do, but it is grassroots and volunteer run outside of project grants through Ontario Arts Council and Toronto Arts Council. So there's a limit to what we can do and what we can ask of people and ourselves. And at the same time, we do want to work towards increasing accessibility, because that's why we started the project, and saw that there's this need for another project like that. So yeah, it's difficult, but it's an important conversation for sure. And yeah, it can be really disheartening.
I don't. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead.
I don't want to take up too much time. That should go to the great questions in the chat. But I would just say Irene's great point. It may also be a post-colonial issue as well. I don't know really enough about the sort of economy of comics publishing to say this with much authority, but I do know that there are definitely creators in the Philippines working for doing work for big IP properties for Marvel and DC. And again, I don't know enough to say that this is a neo-colonial situation, but
you can say
I'm curious. Yeah, there you go. So I think Irene's point is great, and again takes us outside of the sort of the boundaries of Canada.
If I can raise a tangential issue, that one of the things I found interesting about Zviane's deciding to produce one of her comics without copyright and without her name in a sort of very unique way, brings us to the way in which many cartoonists will approach their work with a sense of play. That this is very much, you know, as many people start first drawing comics in their life, this is, yeah, for many people this is work, but there is an element, this is connected to play, and you're changing things. Some people will do this through formal constraints, doing a comic that's wordless, trying to do put in something that makes the new work fun. But this can also be, this sort of experimentation and trying something different can be applied to the economic models if one has the leeway to do that. I know plenty of established cartoonists who work with a publisher will then drop off a small handful of photocopied zines. It's like, these are for you to put out for free. I'm doing a thing that is different because they want to either specifically subvert that model, or they just want to play with the model.
Yeah,
I think you. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think you have a very good point, because it's why I'm doing comics. I just want to play. Like, yes, there is this. There is the fear to, Irene. I think no, it's Diamant. This is your name. Sorry. Was talking about the pressure about the branding or posting on Instagram, on the social medias and everything. This is you see a lot of time on those platforms, ways to be better, to be successful and blah blah, but this is in the mindset that you want to live out of it. You want to earn money, you want to pay the rent with your work, which is very noble. But at the opposite way, you also have a lot of people who are doing. I do have some of my friends who are comic authors who have their job, like they have a part-time job, so they earn money with their job, and then comics is just a side, and it's really just a play. Like, they don't take it really seriously. And this is when you see self-published comics that are very experimental, because if you don't have the pressure to make money out of your comic, you're really, really, really more free to do whatever you want.
And I think that's such a beautiful thing too. That's so important. And yeah, I wish that, what was I gonna say? Looking at comics outside of capitalism, if that's possible, and economic models, because I think for a lot of creators or people, it's a way to survive, and just a way to have that release, and to the pleasure of creating something and engaging with other people, and just discovering community through comics as well. And I just wanted, part of why I wanted C-Call to exist is just showing people what it can do to give people some tools and paper to create something, because I think that's so important. And I think anyone can and should be able to create comics, and that people naturally just approach them in really unique and beautiful ways. So yeah, I'm really glad this was brought up, because something I strongly believe as well is important.
Yeah, you brought up a good point also, because comic is one of the cheapest art.
Yeah.
I've done music. I studied in music, and then I wrote music, and I had to find an orchestra with really expensive instruments. And then I tried a little bit of cinema, when you have to buy these very technologic stuff and blah blah. And when I want to do comics, I just got photocopy paper and 10 cents pens, and that's it. You can do comics. It's the comic. It's how do you say it in English? It's democratic. It's like anyone can do comics. It's so cheap. So this is why I like it.
And on the flip side, it's so labor intensive that,
of course,
if you are trying to do it professionally, right? A book takes 2 years. You can't just write it. It's not enough. You have to draw everything, and this kind of feeds into, again, the production cycle of presses, and how often they want to book out, especially in a series, and the strain that puts on creators who might not be compensated enough for the labor intensiveness of something that, yes, is paper and pen, or, you know, very easy tools to use.
Yeah, and there's all these strange tensions in comics for those reasons, and that like there's all these things working against creators, and that they're so seldom fairly compensated for the amount of time and effort it takes to create a comic. And then there's all these misconceptions about comics that you know, they're just for kids, and et cetera, and they're just playing, or they're not serious. And so there's so many tensions, I guess, working against play, or but also that, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, but at the same time, I have the feeling that at the basis, you have to be a little bit crazy to be a comic book author. Like, you will spend a lot of time drawing, like it's eternal, it never has an end, and you will not have a lot of money for it. Like, there's a natural selection right at the beginning. Like, this is why I think that there's a, I like a lot, how do you say it, le milieu de la bande dessinée, like the
Medium.
The medium, we say the medium. Like, I like, not the medium, like the, I want to talk about the people. The people.
Oh, the scene. You could say the scene.
Yeah, the scene. I really like the comic scene, because compared to other art scene, like there is not a lot of competition. Like, it's very, very friendly, because it's all crazy people. It's all people that decided to put all their heart into it, and like, it's a very suffering, because you don't get a lot of reward. Like, as Rose said, people think you're doing stuff for children, and you're. I also heard people who like heard, oh, you still reading comic at 30, maybe you're a bit retarded. I really heard something like this. Like, there is a lot of stuff that puts comics still underground, and still it's changing right now, but at the same time, it makes the comic scene a really, 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 really friendly place.
If I can grab one of the questions from the chat, or I'm going to read two of them. These are both for Matthew. One asking, in trying to publish your hybrid article in a peer-reviewed professional journal, did you encounter any methodological resistance to your use of comics? And asking if you could tell us a bit more about how mainstream historians will look at graphic history, and also asking if your PhD work incorporated academia in comics form.
Yeah, thanks. So to begin with the second question first, my PhD was the standard history PhD dissertation, all written. Probably near the end, I thought, could I probably could have, but ultimately, like, include some sort of comic element. But ultimately, I viewed them as two separate things, my postdoc and the end of my PhD. And so I've gone on two separate tracks. My dissertation is coming out as a book with UBC, standard all text, traditional history, and another graphic history with Miguel Queens, which illustrated and co-wrote with a historian named Robert Engen. I've seen the kind of the academic peer review process from both sides, the standard text-based article book, and the more of the kind of graphic history illustrated work that I do. And I haven't felt any real resistance to it. That could be because historians who were already kind of interested in comics or interested in this sort of field are more open to it, and those who aren't don't really know about it, because it's still kind of beneath the surface. It's not really gone all that mainstream yet. So historians who might have objections to this approach haven't maybe felt the need to articulate those objections yet. So going through the peer review process, I didn't really face much resistance at all. I have an article that's coming out in Canadian Historical Review, and it's another combination of a graphic article that's also about the idea of graphic history. And I had one reviewer who thought that, it's interesting, but do we need all these pictures? Because I drew all the pictures for it. And so that's kind of sort of interesting about that. I'm trying to write a piece about the implications and usefulness of graphic history. And someone thinks, well, interesting, but can we just get away with like 5 examples as opposed to 20? And then on the other side, I had the reviewer who thought it wasn't comic book enough because my approach, I used more of a kind of a figures-based approach. You're familiar with the idea of an academic book or article, and they'll have figures interspersed throughout. And usually these figures are from someone else's work where I try to include my own. So it's a mix of text and image. So one reviewer thought, not comic book enough, and another thought, yeah, interesting, but do we need all these images? But really, I mean, that's the most kind of resistance I've felt. So not that much. It's been very positive, I've found.
Can I piggyback on this question a little bit?
Please.
Which is, I faced a lot of resistance in my edited volume, Sexuality and Mental Illness in Comics. We approached a publisher who made us wait a long time for an answer. And the general consensus was with this publisher and a few others that it was too experimental. So we had academic articles, we had prose with images, pieces by professional cartoonists. We had small, almost zine-like pieces within it. We had a full-on comics text that spoke to the academic issue, but through comics only. And it was just too all over the place. They didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know what to make of the subject, which had never been done, mental illness and sexuality in comics. So we did get it published with the Journal of Graphic Novel in Comics, who took a chance on us, but it was an uphill battle to get a text that featured so many hybrid forms or media talking about this issue in comics, and sometimes with comics, and sometimes with creators not in comics, or not doing a comic in this case. And it was just too eclectic, which I thought was so wonderful, like to get all these different perspectives and ways of commenting on the subject. I thought it was really organic. So I think academia is starting to change. I think academia is starting to see the value of things like comics dissertations, like done completely in comics. And certainly there's a lot of great scholarship out there that I am reading and other people are creating. And but I think, like academia is trying to work as a legitimizing force, but it's still very conservative. So we got to keep kind of pushing those boundaries as much as possible and keep getting those more experimental ideas out there, like Zviane has been saying with comics.
Is there an element to which I think it has some academics are going to react either with jealousy of, oh, you get to do this for your project and I didn't, or also, oh God, do I have to learn to draw now if this is a new standard?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in that same article I was talking about, another reviewers pointed out that I had sort of indicated that this graphic history idea just opens up to study of the past to people with different skill sets that maybe they don't are interested in writing, but they are interested in drawing. And this reviewer, I think, misinterpreted it as, oh, so now all historians need to learn to draw. No, that wasn't my point, but I think that it is a skill that people should practice. And I think that you learn something from drawing. And it's interesting that writing is taken as a skill that everyone is expected to know in academia, but drawing is seen as something that's not useful. I don't agree with that. I think that you can learn a lot from drawing, and even if you're maybe don't think you're the most proficient, I think it's a different way of thinking.
Linda Barry would be
way of
agree.
trying to imagine the ideas that you're trying to express.
Yes, just everybody hand out copies of Linda Barry's syllabus. Just keep handing those out.
Can I just interrupt quickly, because there's a side conversation going on about this. And I just want to say, a lot of people may not know that the big funding agency for academic scholarship in Canada, SSHRC, actually allows you to hire artists to commission creative work based on your research. And not a lot of people know that. And I mentioned there's a journal, Sequentials, in the US that Jamie Michaels and I hired an artist to do research based on a project we were working on, and it was peer reviewed. So I think things are changing, but it's just not widely known that that's an allowable expense, that you can actually hire an artist and pay them either an honorarium or a set professional rate. And the same for translation and everything. So I think it's up to us to spread that word as people bridging academics and creative stuff, and also to hire artists to do this kind of academic work, because I'm not an artist, but the government and my university might give me money to do that. So I think we need to, as a community, kind of bridge that ourselves. And that was just my little plug for like making sure that you can get money to hire artists professionally to do this.
I have a couple of graphic novels from France that are specifically from their agency equivalent of NSERC, where they paired comic artists with scientists to present their work and make it accessible to the public.
Yeah, and I can say this is all the rage, right? Universities and SSHRC and NSERC want us to do this because we're all supposed to be reaching beyond the ivory tower. So people are making films based on their research, but I think there is more and more acceptance of comics. And it goes back to everything we were talking about yesterday, that librarians and archivists need to know that comics are valid scholarship so they can make the case to collect them. But I think one thing the symposium is trying to do is like bring us together as a community around this. So, and also I just want to mention Nick Sousanis's Unflattening, which I'm sure a lot of people know, but that was his PhD dissertation at Harvard in comics form, and was then published as a book, and he has a website, and I'll put the links in the chat and stop talking now.
Yeah,
well, we are also at our time. So please, Irene, if you want to close us out.
I just wanted to say that, yes, like we spoke about this in earlier conversations, those community connections are so valuable. I was fortunate enough to be a SSHRC-funded PhD scholar for all 4 years, and got to, with that extra time and money, create a pop-up gallery in Newfoundland, bringing the Newfoundland Regiment and their history and their museum together, as well as the QE2 library there, as well as the Memorial English Department. And we got to fly in international speakers like Jason Lutz, Scott Chandler came, Miriam Katin gave her work to the program, and it was through a community of different organizations that we were able to take research that is happening in the university and use it as like knowledge dissemination within the public and engage the public in a subject they were already invested in but maybe hadn't seen through the light and lens of comics. So all of those efforts, all of those community attachments that we are creating right now in the symposium are so valuable, and was what will continue to bring this scholarship and this ideology and this practice forward.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This turned out to be a great discussion. And thank you for putting on a fabulous conference.